Hello, Chi Alpha Nation. Welcome back to Leading in a Pandemic. Today, we are talking with Geoff Mumley and James Jr., missionaries to Western Washington University, who are going to walk us through teamwork, how to communicate and make clear decisions through unclear circumstances. I am incredibly excited for today's conversation. Thank you, James. Thank you, Geoff, for joining us. As we get started, could you just tell us how long have you guys been at Western Washington University?
Yeah, me and James have lived pretty much parallel lives. We were both freshmen at Western the same year, lived in the same dorm that freshman year, did the internship the same year, and have now been on staff for 15 years together at Western.
All right on. Very cool. Were you guys roommates?
No.
We weren't.
No,
we were
James-
supposed to be in the same small group, but I had a group of friends that lived on another floor, and we had a small group there. Geoff likes to say, I chose the cool small group, and his small group was, I don't know what word you would use, Geoff, but
I mean, less
I'll let
cool.
I'll let you define that group. So I don't know. I might be able to confirm that there might have been some truth to that, but mostly it was just the friends that I made. So we weren't roommates. We didn't actually spend we didn't relate a whole lot throughout college, and it wasn't until maybe the tail end of our internship together that we started connecting. Kind of because it seemed like we were competing for a job in Chi Alpha. There was like a spot on the team, and it seemed like we were competing. So we started to pray together, and I think that birthed a beautiful friendship out of that time. So
James was the obvious hire. They needed James way more than they needed me. They found a spot for me to go work at the community college for a few years.
They needed to hire James, so they made room for Geoff Mumley.
There you go.
Now
that was it.
Now he's my boss. So I mean, it all worked out.
Fair enough. 15 years of friendship. That's pretty cool. Common purpose of reaching college students. Common understanding of rooting for many Seattle Seahawks football games and Seattle Supersonics. And who else am I missing here? The Seattle Mariners. Ken Griffey Jr. You guys got a wonderful sports legacy over there. That's pretty cool. Every year, the Seahawks can compete for a championship, and every year I know the Cowboys will go 8-8. So that's wonderful. Wonderful times. Awesome. Well, you guys represent one of our long-standing Chi Alphas at Western Washington University. Tremendous legacy you guys have over there. Looking at a team meeting, which is what we're talking about today, how long has the longest team member been there, and how short has the youngest team member been there at Western Washington University?
Mm-hmm. I mean, when we're talking in our team meetings, that's a combination of our senior staff and our intern group. We also invite our student officers into that team meeting because we found that having students in the room where it happens is a really valuable asset to making good decisions. We're all obviously in relationship with students on a regular basis, but having students in the room for the conversation adds a layer of boots on the ground, grassroots know-how, which has been really helpful. So the person who's been for sure the longest in that room is David Niebel. And gosh, James, how many years? I mean, we just
29,
celebrated 29 years. That's awesome. Yeah. So David was both me and James's discipler when we were interns. And so he's been there he's got legacy. And then the newest, we've got our student officers who are new to their roles this year. So they're fresh. And then some of our interns as well, if it's their first year as an intern, that's their first crack at being in that kind of a team meeting. Right
on. So that's a multi-generational team, multi-demographic team. That's not entirely easy to lead or come to conclusions to in a staff meeting. You have people in there. You got people in there who think Batman is Michael Keaton, and then other people think Batman is Val Kilmer, and other people think Batman is Ben Affleck. I mean, there's so many different people in there, and you might have a few that think Batman is still Adam West. So I would imagine, what a horrible illustration, but I would imagine within that multi-generational and a multi-demographic team, there might be different philosophies. There might be different understandings. What is that like for you guys to get everyone on the same page to come to a decision?
Well, Geoff has been facilitating those meetings for, I mean, it's probably been like, what, 6 or 7 years, you think, Geoff?
Something like
Maybe?
that. Yeah.
Something
Yeah,
like
probably.
that. And I feel like, in some sense, Geoff would talk about not seeking consensus necessarily, but mining for conflict, making sure that everybody's heard, and really pressing ideas, finding out, what do team members think about another team member's idea. And I think Geoff does a really good job of kind of, I think exposing lots of different ways of thinking, and then exploring each of those as a team. And so that's been a skill I've watched Geoff hone over the last number of years, knowing what we are discussing, what we aren't discussing, and keeping us focused. And so he really does a fantastic job of kind of herding the cats around. And I think I think he really tries to tease out, what do you think about this? Or, hey, I heard this, I heard a hint of, something in the way you responded to that. Tell me more about that. And so he does a great job doing that, just facilitating.
Thanks, James.
Yeah. Thanks for leading.
I think that part of it too is like having I think probably the biggest tension is when you have that spread of experience in the room. You've got some people who are already, like our staff team, we're already like in deep in the philosophy. We know why we do what we do, and it's just a question of how. But at the same time, the reason we bring the interns into those conversations is that they're learning the why. And so you're facilitating a meeting in that setting of people running at two different speeds. Yeah. You've got people who are like, hey, I already know what's important and why we do these things. Let's talk about how to do it differently. And then you're training people in the why and trying to get them up to that level. And so it's great to have both sets of minds and hearts in the room, because there are plenty of times where I get lost in the weeds trying to explain, like, okay, this is the history of this, and this is why we do it, and they'll ask a question, and I'll answer the question, and then someone like James or someone experienced on the team will be like, actually, we're not talking about that right now, right? We're talking about this, and I'm like, yes, correct, thank you. Let's back on the track. We'll save that for another time. And so you're constantly managing. Brady is the one who trained us all on how to do this, Brady Bobbink, and one of the things that he, really like helped us think about in terms of how these team meetings function is there's this constant tension between efficiency, making good decisions quickly, and education. We really want these decision-making times to actually make real decisions. We have to actually move on things, right? And we have limited time. We can't just meet for 2 weeks in a row. But at the same time, the internship is a teaching hospital. It's the doctor standing with a bunch of interns around a patient saying, okay, here's how we approach this patient. Here's do you see why I did this? Do you understand why I did this? And so the tension always creates less efficiency than we might prefer in another setting, but more education. And that's always been, I try to balance that as best we can while making good, important decisions in a timely way. So it can be challenging sometimes.
I think that's brilliant, balancing education and efficiency within a team meeting at the same time, so everyone is certain on the why and the how. I've never heard it explained that way before, but that makes complete sense. That's awesome. James, you referenced mining for conflict. It seems like conflict is the elephant in the room that every team tries to avoid. If you're mining for conflict, it becomes the elephant in the room that you're actually trying to embrace, which is hard to do. What have you guys done at Western Washington University to make a team comfortable with conflict?
One of the I think it was maybe our first staff meeting as interns. Geoff and I were both in, and this has been a conversation that has happened every year since we were interns. So I don't know how long it happened before, but Brady gave us this analogy, saying like an idea is like a pen. When you hold out your idea in a staff meeting, if you hold it in this fashion, our natural tendency when our ideas get poked at, or there's conflict around our idea, is to grasp it real tightly, and then all of a sudden we're fighting about the conversation becomes about do I have good ideas? Am I a good thinker? Those kind of things. So he encouraged us to bring our ideas on the back of our hand and to know that, like, you do that and you can't grasp at it, and it allows discussion to happen. So that is an opening framework that we as a staff all embrace, and it's an opening conversation that we have with all of our interns and all of our student leaders who come in, that when we're discussing ideas, we're not discussing your value, we're discussing ideas, and we really believe that the way that you think matched with the way that I think will produce something better. And so that's not always, it's a hard thing to learn as as humans. It's a hard thing to embrace, but that's a framework that we always start with. And that was really helpful for me as a natural, like, I think I have great ideas, and don't mess with it because it's already as good as it's going to get. But that pleasantly, I've been surprised.
Hey, that makes complete sense. I think that requires a significant amount of humility in order to have that teamwork, but it pays off. Your idea times my idea is a better idea. That's awesome. Geoff, teamwork is an essential part for chemistry and capacity, and that happens a lot within team meetings that build on that chemistry and capacity. This school year in your team meetings, you're making a lot of different discussions and different decisions than we've ever had before, because we really don't know what COVID campuses are going to look like this year. So what has it been like making plans for a school year filled with multiple realities?
Yeah. I mean, it's been complicated, right? Like when it first emerged, where, depending on where your, different school calendars were at, our school calendar, we were 2 weeks away from spring break. When they finally said, all right, cancel, and then we'll talk. We'll see what spring looks like. And then, some time into that, they just said, hey, spring is all, we're on the quarter system, so spring is all online. And so we took that first couple of weeks to kind of do like emergency room, what do we do? So we spent some time, again, you have to be, in these kinds of conversations, you have to be really flexible with the how do we do campus ministry, and really inflexible with the why. Why do we do campus ministry? What are we about? What are our fundamental values? No matter what those are, they'll play themselves out in different ways depending on our scenario. So, for example, we took our fivefold, value: discipleship, mission, worship, prayer, and sharing life. And we said, okay, what are these? How do we do these 5 things in an exclusively online capacity? So I took all our team, the officers and the interns and the staff, and we broke into basically 5 work groups and said, your job is to think through, why do we do corporate worship? What is worship? What does it accomplish in our community? Talk through the why, then translate that into how in an online capacity. How do we get to those values in a new way, practically? And we did that with mission. We did that with discipleship. We did that with prayer. And we did that with sharing life. And so at that point, we created an emergency resource on our internet, on our website, for our student leaders to say, hey, we are still going to be about these 5 things. Here's some ideas of what that could look like from your staff, interns, and officers about how to live this out this quarter. So that was kind of like the emergency room zone. And then as we've gotten closer to the end of this school year and started trying to project our plans to the fall, we quickly realized that we actually can't get very practical yet, because we actually don't know what it's going to be like. Like we started, planning out what's our, on-campus outreach going to be. Oh, can we access the dorms if we don't live there? I don't know. How many students are going to live in the dorms? I don't know. How many of our student leaders are going to do school from a distance versus in-person classes? We don't know. And so what we tried to do is we tried to have as many philosophical conversations as we could. Like, no matter what the how is, let's make sure we're really clear on all the why that we're going to do next year. But then we had some like speculative conversations, like, okay, if we had to, the 4 scenarios that Chi Alpha put out, that was really helpful for us to think through what we would do about this situation, what we do about this situation. Oh, this situation we're actually already living in, so we don't really need to brainstorm very much about what we would do. We've been living this. And then we just kind of created rough drafts, like, okay, these are the kind of the ways we might approach it once we have more information. So we're going to come back the last week of August with our interns and our officers and our staff and sort of reconvene and say, okay, based on what we know now about what's just a month away, what are we going to do?
I love it. I think there's a This is our third interview in our third week, and there seems to be a trend of identifying the mission versus the method, the function versus the form, or as you put it, the inflexible why versus the flexible how. I think this is going to be the key to Chi Alpha innovation. If we can identify the absolute principle as separate from the relative program, that's truly where the ideas are going to come from. That's a brilliant, brilliant way of thinking you guys are doing. I've got another question for you. I'm going to direct this one for James, but I'm going to preface it this way. The vast majority of content for developing the 4 priorities of Chi Alpha that you'll see in the Leading Pandemic document came from Western Washington University. You guys had great ideas, from celebrating wins regularly to creating a devotional guide for spirit baptism, Chi Alpha house churches with shorter messages and sermon discussions, zooming in world missionaries, healthy work schedules, and even a hybrid discipleship that can take place in person and online. Reading these brilliant answers are easy to do, but coming up with these brilliant ideas, I'm sure, was not easy. Many of the data that we have suggests that there are 2 types of people in crisis mode during staff meetings. There are those who will not make any decision until all the facts are in, and there are those that want to make a decision now, believing that waiting for all the facts to come in will be too late. So how did your team make clear decisions through unclear circumstances?
Well, I would say we definitely have both of those people on our team. And, I think in a sense, you've got, it's kind of like you've got those that want to really project and think we need to make our plans right now. Some of that's like trying to secure the future in advance, reaching out into the uncertain future and creating certainty. However, that doesn't quite work. So it feels like, in one sense, the folks that want to secure the future now are kind of like the kite, and the other folks are kind of like the anchor to the ground. And in some sense, we have to work in tandem. And so actually having to think about these 4 scenarios from Chi Alpha was really helpful, because it gave us something to, hey, let's assume this is true. We just have to pretend, and this exercise is actually going to push our thinking. It's going to push our creativity. And so I think what's even crazy about the whole scenario and working with those 2 different groups of people was this is all happening over Zoom. So, I mean, talk about
which is tricky.
Another challenge, when you're talking, I don't know, our meetings are probably about
2 hours,
30 people, 2 hours. And so really the framework and how we got people moving. I think ultimately we all agreed that we actually don't know are we going to be in the second wave in the fall? We don't know that. Is the university going to be open? We don't know that. We can only go off of what they are kind of saying right now. And so we're going to project for the sake of moving our minds and getting ourselves thinking, being creative. And ultimately, when push comes to shove, we're going to have some meetings at the end of August. Since our schools start towards the end of September, we're going to have some meetings at go time and really figure out which of these brainstorms that we've gone through will really fit. So I think it helps. That helped the people that really have a hard time making decisions without all of the information. That really helps them be able to enter in. And I think being able to begin projecting really helped those that were on the end of we really need to make some movements now. So actually, Chi Alpha National just did us a great service by giving us some real things to think through. And Geoff was able to, the way that it worked out is, and I don't know if you had much intentionality when you set up the teams, but he broke our team into 4 different work groups, and each two work groups on each scenario. Those work groups worked independently of each other to talk through just the way that he framed the framework that he talked about in that last one. How do we do these 5 things in this scenario? Then we came back and each group presented their work. And we basically like to ask questions into that, ideas. Hey, what about this? Did you think about this? Those ideas all became better. Then we kind of meshed the two groups working on the same scenarios together. And we did that for both for both scenarios that we worked on. So, I mean, it was really helpful. I think the way in which it was framed really helped. So we're projecting on something, and we'll also have a day where we can really evaluate, is this actually going to be the way we go? So even since those conversations in some of our team meetings, we've had oh man, that was a great idea, but is that actually going to be the best idea? We don't know.
Sure.
We had some doubts about it. So, I think everything's live right now, and thankfully the Lord knows. So yeah.
Right on. And if you, Chi Alpha Nation, want to read more of the ideas that came from Western Washington University or any of the campuses that filled out the survey, feel free to click on the link below, Leading in a Pandemic, a document compiled by Dr. Harvey Herman. It'll show you all the data regarding 4 scenarios and guiding principles and ideas, and more ideas to help you navigate college ministry during a COVID year on campus. And if you have any questions for Geoff Mumley, if you have any questions for James Jr., feel free to write in the comment section. These guys are with us live. They'll respond to you. They'll answer whatever you got during this time frame, and perhaps even after. Geoff, you guys sound like you have tremendously fun staff meetings filled with 30 people, multi-demographic, multi-generational. Does your team have any rules for engagement to help get you guys from A to B?
Yeah, for sure we do. So I'm going to drop a couple of resources. And Alex, I think you really like this guy, Patrick Lencioni.
He's wonderful. Absolutely.
I bet. I've heard you mention him before in multiple podcasts. But his book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and his book, Death by Meeting. Those two have really shaped how we function in our staff meetings. And the values in those books have shaped a lot of our rules of engagement in our staff meeting times. Some things that come to mind that are just worth mentioning is it's really important for there to be confidentiality in the room, because you want to be able to talk about your ideas freely without worrying about someone who wasn't a part of the conversation hearing about the conversation outside. And so it's important to have to know that, hey, the way we talk about things here, we're going to be respectful and honoring and all those things, but I need to be able to say, I don't think that's a good idea without someone who's not in the room hearing, oh, Geoff didn't like this idea, which isn't necessarily true. I just think there's a better way to do it. So that's an important one. Another one is this concept of buy-in. James mentioned earlier that we don't seek consensus, but we do seek buy-in. So I'm not looking to make sure that every single person in the room agrees. I actually think better decisions are made when there's disagreement in a room. And so Patrick Lencioni talks about mining for conflict. You seem like you don't really agree. Why is that? Tell me more about that. And the number of decisions that have changed because someone went, I'm not sure, even though the rest of the room was like, yeah, let's do it. And then they voice it and their whole room goes, oh, we hadn't thought about that. We can't do this. We're going to change this idea. So the idea of buy-in is that whether you agree with it or not, you feel heard. So in other words, like if you don't agree with an idea, if you don't think we should go this way, you have to say so. And if you don't say so, you don't get to be grumpy about the fact that we went forward with it and you didn't like it. But if you say so, and then you feel understood by the room, that allows you to say, I voiced my concern, I was understood by the room, and we still decided, having heard that input, we still decided to go forward. I can get behind that because I have buy-in. I might not do it myself if this was just up to me, but I feel heard and trusted by my team, so I can back this up. That's a really important one. The other one that's really important is that when we do make a decision, we communicate that decision to the broader community with one voice. All of us, even if we didn't agree or have a sense of like, yes, this is what I think we should do, because I have buy-in to the team's decision, this is now the team's decision, and I'm going to back it up to people who weren't in the room. So if somebody says that was a lame idea, I will say, yeah, it didn't seem like it worked very well, but we really thought as a team it would work really well. Rather than, yeah, I thought so too, but James thought it was going to work, so it's his bad. We don't do any of that. We're one voice in communicating decisions.
Right.
And then the last one is kind of something you mentioned about how, and James mentioned earlier, is we're discussing ideas, not identities. And so you can throw an idea out and say, hey, let's talk about this idea. But if it's attached to how smart am I, how appreciated am I by this team, that all that depends on how they respond to my idea, then you can't really have a good conversation about it because suddenly I'm discussing whether or not I like James or not. and not whether or not I think this idea is going to work. And so that distinction is important to make. Like, hey, I'm not disagreeing with you as a human, or I don't think you're not smart because this idea could be better. Let's talk about this idea and leave our identities out of it. And those ideas always get better when they're not like, this defines me. So those are some really important rules of engagement. The other thing too is I make sure it's really important that, because buy-in is so important and everyone has a voice, if someone's being quiet, I'll say like, hey, there's a couple folks who haven't engaged yet. Feel free to engage. And if you don't, I might just call on you and ask you what you think. And so then everyone's kind of on alert, like, oh, dang, I'm expected to be a part of this conversation, even in a big group. A lot of times this year, because the group is large, we've broken into smaller groups and had discussions at that level. And then they'll kind of report out to the whole room, here's what we think, and we'll have a whole room discussion about it. That seems to really help people participate in different ways that are important.
I think, yeah, humility is a piece in that conversation. And also when somebody feels hurt by something that was said, or feels like, man, you didn't acknowledge me, or, you dismissed or talked over me or something. Geoff sets the stage really well for people to share. Hey, if you're hurt by something, you got to go to the person who you felt hurt by, or who you felt was put you down or something. And actually, Geoff has just modeled that really well in times. I mean, he's a verbal processor and a confident communicator. And so sometimes, he just can be interpreted in certain ways. And so he'll regularly, even in front of the group, or I'll see him go off and say, hey, can I grab you after the meeting? And just make sure that relationally people are good. So that's something that has been modeled and also encouraged among all of our teammates.
I like that. I think there's so much wisdom in that. If I go to someone directly that I'm in conflict with, that's how resolution happens. But if I go indirectly to someone I'm at peace with to talk about that person I'm in conflict with, that's how revolution happens. And so it can only be one or the other. I think the culture that you guys have built of health, mining for conflict, is so healthy. Awesome. And again,
a lot of that comes from Brady too. Like Brady always said, like, if you offend someone in front of people, then you need to make right with them in front of people, because everyone in the room kind of goes, ooh, so I got to make sure that I say, like, hey guys, like, the way I responded to that question, that wasn't cool. So-and-so, I'm sorry I did that, but whole team, that's not how we do this. And so if it was private, then we do it privately. If it was public, then we make right publicly, because it's just a part of being good teammates. So,
Chi Alpha Nation, those books again are The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni and Death by Meeting by Patrick Lencioni. If you're looking for better team cohesion or for better staff meetings, those are wonderful, wonderful readings that we recommend. James, I got another question for you. Celebrating wins was mentioned a few times within your data responses to help build healthy leaders, which in turn builds healthy teams. Why is celebrating wins essential to y'all's teamwork?
Wow. Well, I think every team wants to win, right? I mean, we want to do our mission well, and celebrating the things that we're hoping to have happen in our ministry and on our teams actually reinforces exactly what we want. I think when we celebrate things, people glean the value out of them and begin to model and chase after the things that we're celebrating. So we could sit and say, here's what you don't do, here's what you don't do, here's what you don't do. And that doesn't create a whole lot of, it doesn't make people want to do that necessarily. Right. It makes them feel like they have to do that. But when we celebrate wins, it really highlights what we're trying to do in our ministry. So it's kind of the best bang for your buck in that way. You just get to celebrate, and who doesn't like celebrating? And then it reinforces your mission, what you're hoping to see out of your mission.
That's awesome. So what I'm hearing is we get what we celebrate. We get what we ask people to do, not necessarily what we ask people not to do. So that's wise. A positive culture of reaffirmation. You guys are doing a phenomenal job there at Western Washington. In y'all's data, and I suppose this is my last question for today, you mentioned that you wanted to have Chi Alpha house churches of 30 or less, which requires significant more teamwork. And you mentioned having an outside pastor with shorter sermons, not longer sermons, but shorter sermons. It's true that the preacher's job is to leave the audience wanting more by saying less, but the preacher's temptation is to say more because we fear anything else could result in less. So how did your team come to the conclusion that shorter messages will not compromise the quality of the message?
Yeah, I think we were convinced. There's a book that was recommended in the Campus Ministry Leadership podcast called Marching Off the Map, where they talked about the shrinking attention span of students and the different ways you could respond to that. One way you could say is, students are so much lamer now because they don't like to listen to longer sermons, or they can't listen to longer sermons. Or you could say, oh, well, this is the way the culture's going, so we'll just bend with, we'll just do whatever the culture wants. Or like the wind in a sail, you could harness the way the culture's going and angle your sail in a certain way to make the most of it. And what we've tried to do with our sermon length is, how can we reduce the length of our sermons to maximize the attention and retention of what our students are hearing? And so one of the things that we did is we didn't shrink down the total time of a sermon. So our sermons used to be about 30 to 35 minutes. We'd shoot for that. What we tried to do is we tried to inject at key points throughout the sermon opportunities for discussion and engagement with some form of media. So whether it's a Bible project video, or hey, turn to your neighbor and talk about what's buzzing in your mind right now. Just take 2 minutes to talk about that. Or turn to your neighbor and pray for our community that God would grow the thing we just talked about in our community. Yes. And that transitioned really helpfully to an online Zoom platform, because Zoom has these breakout rooms. And so what we had 100 students on a Zoom call, and we would preach, in a sense, for about maybe 8 to 10 minutes tops into a screen, which, man, if you're going to lose attention span in live person, you're really going to lose it on a screen. So you got to really shrink it down. And then we go into breakout rooms and discuss, okay, what was just talked about? There'd be like 1 or 2 questions you could talk about with your group. And we would do 2 to 3 breakout rooms per sermon. And so ultimately we ended up preaching maybe 15 to 20 minutes tops. But the breakout room engagement, it also allowed a staff and an intern to be in most of the breakout rooms. And so we could pastor a small group of people in a short amount of time in really meaningful ways. And our students gave us great feedback about how blessed they were by that kind of format. So it really seemed to be productive.
I think that's awesome. I'm reading Preaching Is It Rocket Science by Dr. Jim Bradford. And he's mentioning that the era of Charles Spurgeon and G. Campbell Morgan, when you can preach for 2 hours, and the era of Billy Graham, when you can preach for 1 hour, it doesn't exist anymore.
No.
Looking at 20-minute sermons max, most likely 15 for the average attention span. And it makes sense. I think the breakout rooms that you're doing is innovative, and it goes in line with what Generation Z is looking for. They're looking to give input into someone else's output, and it seems that helps them retain the information. Awesome idea. Wonderful idea you guys are doing over here, and I'm excited to see what the outcome is of it. Again, Chi Alpha Nation, if you have any questions for Geoff and James, please feel free to write in the comments. They'll get back to you as soon as they can. You guys have done a phenomenal job helping us learn about teamwork and how to make clear decisions during unclear circumstances. The things that I've learned in this session alone, I think are going to help me for years and years to come, well beyond a pandemic. Chi Alpha, please join us next Tuesday as we'll hear from Weta Bradford deliver a sermon on David and Goliath and what that means for COVID in the college campus right now. We love you guys so much. We're praying for you as you reconcile students to Christ, transforming university, the marketplace, and the world.